This is a giant undertaking, but I consider this a personal film. It's my film of a lifetime. I read the book when I was 18 years old and thought then, I can't wait till the movie comes out. 20 years later, no one had done it, so I got impatient. Hey everyone, Yoyston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we are looking at the future of all Lord of the Rings projects as they are here in early 2025, all the news we've gotten about them and other types of projects so far, while looking back at the past few years and how people have reacted thus far to what we've most recently gotten. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. So let's start by looking back at just over the past 2 years or so. Beyond a few mobile games, we kicked off the newest bouts of mainstream adaptations for The Lord of the Rings, since really the Shadow of Mordor and War Games, with Rings of Power Season 1 back in late 2022. While I think many people saw it as mediocre to terrible, honestly, Amazon pushed on for round 2. In 2023, we got the Gollum game, which is safe to say got absolutely demolished on the world stage and on the internet. It was disastrous for many reasons, and although I gave it a 7 out of 10 on my review myself, mostly for lore and character reasons that I care more about anyway, less than for the actual, game itself, I still see how bad that really was as a game. I don't plan on really ever playing that again. Later that year, however, we got what I think was a really good game in a group of people, a pretty alright game by oneself, Return to Moria. 4th Age, Gimli, fighting orcs, trolls, and a dragon, all while finding your way across Moria. It was a great adaptation. Then we got Rings of Power Season 2. And while I do think it was a slight bit better overall maybe than Season 1, looking back on it, it still really sucked, in my opinion. And there are arguments to be made that it got worse in some ways. But finally, we come to the most recent new mainstream, or at least attempting to be mainstream, adaptation for Lord of the Rings, which was The War of the Rohirrim. The movie that I think was the best Lord of the Rings on-screen adaptation as some sort of film or show, since An Unexpected Journey or Desolation of Smaug at least. But most people couldn't get into the anime or did not appreciate the story or its leading character. Honestly, as something that attempted to break into the mainstream by releasing in theaters, it never really did. And while perhaps it was more famous than fan films, honestly, it was somewhere between fan films and The Hobbit, right? And don't get me wrong, there have been great fan films to come out in recent years, but the problem is, again, they go unappreciated or underground. And it came out later that Warner Brothers fast-tracked the movie in order to keep the rights to The Lord of the Rings at all. So, to me, that's a bit disheartening, but we'll come back to this. We look at the history here since, again, 2022 or so, just to look at where we're headed from now on. We will have Season 3 of Rings of Power, unfortunately. And there will be a big time jump according to recent news, but honestly it's already difficult to tell how long it's been between episodes and seasons. That's going to be whatever. I'm not here to rant really about how bad Rings of Power is. We kind of get it at this point. We're going to get the creation of the One Ring, etc. I don't really care. I give it more grace than it deserved, particularly after Season 1, but not again. I've learned my lesson going into Season 3. I know what this show is, and it's too late for it to be really fixed, so we're just going to see it to its end. It appears to be some sort of highly budgeted cash grab for Amazon designed to get people to sign up for Prime, and perhaps if the show is a loss, it's still also a nice tax write-off, potentially. I'm not sure if it works like that, but there's a reason they're doing it, and they don't really care about keeping it close to the source material. It just keeps the Amazon wheel going, like Wheel of Time. As long as it calls itself Lord of the Rings, I will watch and review it. It does not deserve to call itself that and not get a fair shakedown by people who honestly care deeply about the source material. Beyond this, and looking to a more hopeful future, we will have the potential Hunt for Gollum movie in 2026 or so. Maybe one of a few Lord of the Rings movies that Warner Brothers will put out about the source material in a prequel kind of sense. Now, don't get me wrong, it will be great to see Andy Serkis, Ian McKellen, potentially Viggo, and all the rest return for their characters. I'm beyond excited for that. And I'm hopeful that it'll be good, but I am a bit worried about this project in some new ways, particularly after how the last few adaptations have been received. Prequels rarely, if ever, match the original story and how much people love that. Think Rings of Power or The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings, Star Wars prequels to the original, House of the Dragon to Game of Thrones, etc. Beyond this, I'm seeing a consistent trend of people generally not enjoying the Middle-earth projects that have come out recently. If they are positively received, it's usually by a select few. People hated Rings of Power and the Gollum game. Rightfully so, in my opinion. They did not generally enjoy War of the Rohirrim, and they thought Return to Moria was more or less okay or good, which I think War of the Rohirrim and Return to Moria are underrated. But here is the problem. Both on screen or for games, no one is screaming from the rooftops about how amazing any of this stuff is, not like people did for The Lord of the Rings or even the Hobbit movies, or honestly even Shadow of Mordor, Shadow of War. People loved those games. Those were mainstream. And the only time it feels like Lord of the Rings projects enter the mainstream these days is when it's not particularly good, like Rings of Power. Amazon can say what they will, but people do not love that show. At best, it is a very mixed to negative reaction, and I keep hearing that with both Season 1 and 2, people start the season, but don't finish it. So where does that leave us? We'll come back to this in a moment. But speaking of games, we will also, next month, have Tales of the Shire. It's a cozy game that I expect will have, and perhaps is intending to have, a small or niche audience. I don't think a game like this, the people making it, expect it to break into the mainstream really at all. It looks alright so far. I'm excited to give it a shot. Beyond this, we have one Lord of the Rings MMO, maybe, that Amazon is developing. We've heard that one was in the works and then it got canceled, and now another one might be in the works again. However, I'm not holding my breath for it, because as far as I know, it is still on, but I haven't heard any recent news about it. And I feel like they would be trying to hype it up, especially with Rings of Power, and trying to get it out if they were super serious about it. I'm not sure. As for the Lord of the Rings Online, it will always have my love, but I must say that its quality, the quality of its quests and storytelling and expansions, has been really lacking in recent years for the most part. Besides, ever since at least the destruction of the One Ring back in 2017, Lord of the Rings Online has not been mentioned too much in most mainstream circles, or only is rarely mentioned, maybe when those expansions come out. Now, I do want to plug that I would still recommend the game at least through the Minas Morgul expansion. There's so much good lore there, and so many good things to experience if you haven't gone through that before. I still love most of the game, but I have been disappointed by it recently. So here's the question. With a franchise as big as The Lord of the Rings, why isn't there more? And I guess, why isn't there more good stuff? To be honest, I'm not sure. I think there might be, I don't know if burnout is the right word for it, amongst the general public. I think most people were, and really are only at this point, interested in the War of the Rings story, right now at least, and the end of Sauron. And since everyone already knows what happens there because of the original trilogy, many people are paying more attention just to other fandoms and other projects at the moment. However, I think there is at least one thing that could change that, and I may even say is so grand itself that it might be different than other prequels, in that it could just be as big as the Lord of the Rings movies if they're made correctly, whether it's movies or TV seasons or something else. And of course that's the Silmarillion, which is held very, very tightly by the rights owners. The Silmarillion will enter the public domain in 2044, but maybe they will allow someone who they trust to buy the rights to it before that happens, I think, so that we do get some sort of adaptation for it. But we definitely have some time before we see that. Besides this, to be honest, I think it will be way harder to get a Silmarillion adaptation right, even harder than a Lord of the Rings adaptation, which they've been struggling with recently. If Lord of the Rings or its appendices or its background, etc., has been tough to adapt recently, the Silmarillion will just be that much harder. It needs to be a focused, disciplined adaptation, honed in on telling particular stories so it doesn't get lost in the depth that the Silmarillion has. But until then, here's what I think they should do to maybe make a lot more games, movies, shows, whatever it is, to get the Lord of the Rings story back on track with mainstream audiences. Funny enough, Return to Moria and War of the Rohirrim, even though they were underrated, are awesome directions to head in. such as anything really from the appendices. There are so many wars, as I've gone on about in other videos, so many different adventures, things like that, characters, stories to draw from that are in the Lord of the Rings domain of stories, aka in the appendices of the Lord of the Rings. But they need to make them a bit more mainstream. Return to Moria is a survival game, and we've never really had a Lord of the Rings survival game before. Again, I'm glad they branched out and did it. I like those kinds of games. But since that was so new, and it wasn't on Steam at launch, right, I don't think it particularly took off. And War of the Rohirrim was an anime, so if that had been live action, maybe that would have done better. Again, they need to work on making them more mainstream. Even though, as I said before, I personally love that they're branching out and trying new things, and I like anime, so I think that was an awesome thing to try. And I also think a Silmarillion anime would be incredible, so they need to think about their audience, however. I also think it's past time that we had a new Lord of the Rings open-world RPG, but again, maybe telling a different story, or it could tell some version of the Lord of the Rings War of the Rings story again, but it could also be set in the Second or the Third Age, some point in those appendices. I think that would be awesome. Again, there's a reason that the Shadow of Mordor, Shadow of War games did so well. It would be great to have something like that again. Maybe not set in Mordor this time, because we've got so many games set in Mordor. My only thing is I really want them to stay truer to the lore than the Shadow games were. Now, finally, here's one that I think is a huge one that they really, really should consider doing, because right now they're just leaving so much money on the table. If they can, they should remaster a bunch of the old, amazing Lord of the Rings games, like Battle for Middle-earth, or Return of the King, or anything like that. Even the old Hobbit game. I think people would love these to be updated, modernized. Conquest, Lord of the Rings Conquest. So many amazing games that are now around 20 or so years old that I think if they either made a sequel for, or a remaster, or both, people would just absolutely go crazy for them and would be interested to see continuations of their stories on the big screen. It would be so easy in so many ways, and I think they should just really consider doing that. Other franchises have been doing it to a lot of success, thinking the Age of Mythology remake or the Diablo 2 remake and many others. But unfortunately, that's really all we have. A lot of the news and the conjecture that I covered today, we'll have to see how it all turns out. I'm really afraid of the worst case scenario, being that the new movies, Rings of Power Season 3, new games that they flop and people move away from Lord of the Rings, right? And audiences think that maybe it's not as great as it actually is, and game creators, developers, movie makers, they also move away from it because they don't see it as super profitable anymore, or something like that. I love that there's so much passion and so many eyes looking towards the Lord of the Rings right now and towards Middle-earth and the Silmarillion. And I want to keep them there, but keep them there for a good reason, right? I want good games, good movies, good TV shows, and really because of how amazing the source material is, there's no reason we shouldn't be having those already. So, what do you all think, my friends? Is there a way out of this cycle that adaptations have gotten into recently? Why has it become like that, and what adaptations should people make? Let me know all of that in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please hit that like button and share this with a friend. I really hope we get some more amazing projects, and we know it's possible because of the decade or so after the Lord of the Rings films came out. It wasn't just a one-hit wonder sort of thing. There's a lot of good potential here. I want good Lord of the Rings content so badly. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider getting some candles for our friends Mythologie Candles, or order some Weddit or United Cutlery Lord of the Rings sword statues and other replicas from Castle Con, who does international shipping, and use the code WEST at checkout. And please check out our merch, and join our memberships on Patreon for access to our Discord and our monthly podcast, an episode of which is coming in the next week or so. Thanks to our Valar tier patrons and YouTube members, Ed Patterson, ComicNut64, Brian Hunley, Peter Sheppard, John Hume, Rhys Jenkins, Arthur, Merlin, Theodore, Zoomi, Todesmorgen, and Joby Weasel. Thank you so much. You guys keep the channel going. Please subscribe to join the Men of the West, and I'll see you all again next time. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.